On the grounds of the Catholic University of America in Washington, Ethiopian religious manuscripts are coming to life.
What if the story you learned about Christianity didn't start where you think it did? Not in Rome, not in Europe, and not under the shadow of an empire. For centuries, we've been told a clean, orderly timeline. Christianity spreads from the Roman world, councils define belief, scripture gets locked in, and everything else fades into the background. But there's a problem with that story. While Rome was still arguing over doctrine and authority, an African kingdom had already made Christianity its state faith, built its own theology, and started producing sacred books that still exist today. And now, after centuries of being ignored outside its own tradition, a set of ancient Ethiopian texts is forcing scholars and believers to confront an uncomfortable question. What if an entire branch of early Christianity developed alongside Rome, preserved teachings the West never kept, and recorded parts of the story we were never taught to look for? Because once you follow Ethiopia's trail, the familiar history starts to feel incomplete. The moment Ethiopia enters the Christian story, the timeline starts to break. In the early 4th century, in a powerful trading kingdom called Aksum, something happened that rarely shows up in Western textbooks. King Ezana made Christianity the official faith of his empire, not as a private belief, not as a tolerated sect, as state practice. Coins, inscriptions, and royal declarations all reflect the shift. This wasn't a slow drift toward Christianity. It was a deliberate political and spiritual decision that reshaped an entire kingdom. Here's where the discomfort sets in. That decision happened around the 320s and 330s. Rome, meanwhile, didn't make Christianity its official religion until decades later, when Emperor Theodosius issued the Edict of Thessalonica in 380. In other words, while the Roman world was still debating how Christianity should function inside imperial power, Ethiopia had already committed to it as the foundation of public life. And this wasn't the fringe or dependent conversion. Aksum was a global player, controlling Red Sea trade routes, minting its own currency, and engaging with the Mediterranean world as an equal. When Christianity arrived, it did so through Syrian and Egyptian networks, not Roman command. Ethiopia wasn't following Rome's lead, it was choosing its own path. That single fact quietly flips the familiar narrative. Christianity didn't flow outward from Rome into a passive world. It took root in multiple centers at once. And Ethiopia wasn't late to the story. It was early, confident, and independent, which raises a deeper question. If this African kingdom was already Christian before Rome finalized its own religious identity, what kind of Christianity was it actually building?
The evidence of that early Christianity isn't hidden in theory. It's written on parchment, painted in gold, and still physically exists. On the grounds of Ethiopian monasteries, and now in a few carefully controlled collections outside the country, are gospel books that shouldn't exist according to the usual timeline. They're known as the Germa Gospels, and scientific testing places them shockingly early. Radiocarbon analysis dates parts of these manuscripts as somewhere between the 4th and 6th centuries, with some estimates overlapping the very years of King Ezana's reign. Let that sink in. These aren't rough drafts or fragmented scraps. They're fully illustrated gospel books, written in Ge'ez, with vibrant colors and intricate iconography. That level of artistic and theological maturity suggests a Christian culture that was already literate, organized, and deeply invested in scripture long before medieval Europe produced its famous illuminated Bibles. This matters because manuscripts don't appear out of nowhere. To create books like these, you need trained scribes, stable institutions, theological confidence, and a community that expects these texts to be read, copied, and revered. Ethiopia wasn't experimenting with Christianity, it was living it. And when you place these manuscripts next to the Roman timeline, the contrast becomes uncomfortable. While Europe would later celebrate its great biblical art as the birth of Christian culture, Ethiopia had already been doing this quietly for centuries, which leads to the next unsettling realization. These books didn't just preserve familiar stories, they carried an entire scriptural tradition the rest of the world never fully kept. This is where Ethiopia stops looking like an early adopter and starts looking like a guardian. Among its manuscripts are complete versions of ancient books that most of the world only knows in pieces. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees. In Western tradition, these texts survive as fragments scattered across languages, footnotes in academic debates, or discoveries pulled from caves like the Dead Sea Scrolls. But in Ethiopia, they were never fragments. They were whole, readable books, copied and used as living scripture for centuries. That detail changes everything. While modern scholars were reconstructing
sentences from damaged parchment. Ethiopian monks were reading full chapters, preserving genealogies, visions, and cosmologies exactly as they had been handed down. When fragments of Enoch and Jubilees surfaced among the Dead Sea Scrolls, they didn't expose Ethiopian texts as inventions, they confirmed them as authentic witnesses to a much older religious world. And these weren't marginal curiosities. The Dead Sea Scrolls show that these books matter deeply in Second Temple Judaism. They shaped how people thought about angels, time, law, and divine order. Yet later, Western Christianity moved away from them, not because they vanished, but because priorities shifted. Ethiopia didn't make that shift. Its church valued visionary literature, cosmic history, and contemplative theology, so it kept what others set aside, which leads to an uncomfortable realization. If Ethiopia preserved entire books the rest of the world lost or trimmed away, what else might be hiding in its canon that exists nowhere else on Earth? To understand why Ethiopia kept these texts while others didn't, you have to stop thinking in terms of conspiracy and start thinking in terms of priorities. As Christianity spread through the Roman world, it faced a practical problem. How do you hold together a massive, diverse population under one belief system? That question shaped everything. Councils were called, creeds were refined, and over time, church leaders favored writings that supported clarity, uniform teaching, and centralized authority. Texts that complicated doctrine or opened too many interpretive paths slowly fell out of favor. Ethiopia was operating under a different logic. Its church developed outside Roman political control, in its own language, with its own liturgy and rhythms. Instead of asking how belief could be governed, Ethiopian Christianity focused on how faith could be experienced. Visionary texts, cosmic histories, and contemplative writings weren't distractions. They were tools. That's why books like Enoch and Jubilees remained central. They offered expansive views of the universe, moral timekeeping, and divine order that shaped daily spiritual life. These texts weren't hidden or protected out of fear. They were preserved openly because they served the purpose within Ethiopian theology. This distinction matters because scripture doesn't just record belief, it forms it. When one tradition trims complexity for unity and another preserves it for encounter, the results look radically different over time. And Ethiopia's choice led to something even more surprising. Beyond ancient Jewish texts, it preserved teachings about Jesus himself that no other
This is where Ethiopia's tradition becomes impossible to ignore. Within its canon exists a complete text focused on a part of Jesus' life most traditions barely explore at all: the 40 days after the resurrection. In Ethiopian tradition, this text is known as the Book of the Covenant, or Masafakidan, and unlike brief gospel summaries, it treats those 40 days as a sustained period of teaching, not a transitional pause. According to this tradition, the risen Jesus spends that time instructing his closest followers in prayer, spiritual perception, and inner transformation. The emphasis isn't on rules or institutions, but on preparation, how to recognize divine presence, how to interpret visions, how resurrection changes the way time, law, and reality itself are understood. The number 40 isn't accidental. In biblical memory, it marks testing, revelation, and initiation. Moses on Sinai, Israel in the wilderness, Jesus fasting in the desert. Ethiopia reads the post-resurrection period the same way, not as filler between Easter and Ascension, but as the final formation of the disciples, when understanding moves beyond words and into lived experience. For centuries, Ethiopian churches used these teachings in liturgy and monastic life. They weren't whispered secrets or banned texts. They were part of the spiritual toolkit. What's new isn't their existence, it's the attention they're finally receiving outside Ethiopia. And that raises the next question. If these teachings were always there, why has the wider world only started noticing them now?
The short answer is that nothing was suddenly uncovered. What changed was who was paying attention. These texts were never buried in caves or smuggled through history and secret. Ethiopian monasteries copied them, taught from them, and passed them down openly for well over 1,000 years. The real gap wasn't preservation, it was translation and academic focus. Western scholarship simply didn't prioritize Ethiopian sources, largely because they sat outside the familiar Greek and Latin pipelines that shaped European theology. For a long time, academic energy flowed in one direction. Scholars searched for early Christianity through Roman archives, Mediterranean manuscripts, and later European libraries. Ethiopia's Ge'ez tradition existed in parallel, but it wasn't central to the conversation, not because it lacked value, but because it didn't fit the inherited framework of how Christian history was supposed to look. Only recently have more translations, manuscript studies, and comparative analyses begun circulating beyond specialist circles. And even now, there is no single widely accepted modern English edition that fully captures how texts like the Mashafa Kidan function inside Ethiopian religious life. What's emerging today isn't a revelation, it's a recognition that a whole stream of Christian Christian thought has been flowing quietly alongside the Western one all along. Once you see that, the bigger picture snaps into focus. Christianity didn't develop as one unified system that later fractured. It grew as multiple sophisticated traditions, asking different questions from the very beginning. And that realization forces us to confront the deeper divide that when you zoom out, it becomes clear that early Christianity didn't move in a single direction. It split into two parallel paths, each shaped by a different core question. In the Roman world, Christianity became a problem of scale. How do you unify belief across an empire? That question pushed leaders towards structure, hierarchy, and fixed definitions. Councils debated theology, creeds clarified belief, and a streamlined canon supported institutional stability. The goal wasn't mystery, it was coherence, a faith that could govern millions under one system. Ethiopia asked something else entirely. What happens when faith centers on direct encounter with the divine? Free from Roman political pressure, its tradition emphasized vision, prayer, sacred calendars, and spiritual transformation. Texts were valued not only for doctrinal alignment, but for their ability to shape inner life and perception of the cosmos. This difference explains why the Ethiopian canon looks unfamiliar to Western eyes. It's larger, more fluid, and filled with visionary material that Western councils eventually sidelined, not because it was false, but because it didn't serve the same purpose. Rome needed order. Ethiopia cultivated experience. Neither path was accidental. Each reflected the needs of its community, but the consequences were massive. One tradition shaped global institutions and creeds. The other preserved a spiritual library focused on encounter rather than control. And for centuries, those paths rarely crossed. Until now, when the questions modern people are asking start to sound eerily similar to the ones Ethiopia answered long ago. And that brings us to why this matters today. For centuries, Western Christianity built itself around rules, hierarchies, and doctrinal certainty. But in the modern world, millions of people feel something is missing. Church attendance declines. Traditional models of faith feel hollow. And spiritual seekers are asking questions that institutions can't always answer. They're not rejecting God. They're searching for direct experience, personal encounter, and guidance that speaks to daily life, not just creeds. Ethiopia's preserved tradition speaks directly to that hunger. The manuscripts and teachings, some over 1,700 years old, emphasize visionary insight, mystical practice, and contemplative formation. They guide believers in prayer, in recognizing divine presence, and in understanding the resurrection as a transformation of perception rather than a historical event to memorize. These texts were always alive within Ethiopian monastic communities, even as the wider world overlooked them, and the timing couldn't be more striking. Suddenly, in 2025, the questions people are asking about meaning, encounter, and spiritual depth align perfectly with what Ethiopian Christianity has been preserving for centuries. What was once considered obscure, mystical, or peripheral now resonates as a solution to a modern spiritual gap. It's a vivid reminder. History isn't linear, and the development of faith isn't a single road. For over a millennium, Ethiopia cultivated a path that prioritized experience over authority, encounter over control, and living wisdom over institutional conformity. And today, that path offers insights that the Western world has been quietly searching for without always realizing. And here's the most striking part. Ethiopia didn't preserve these texts by accident, and they weren't intended to shock the world. They were preserved because they worked. The Mashafa Kidan and other unique scriptures were used in everyday spiritual life, read in monasteries, recited in prayer, and integrated into liturgy. They shaped how believers understood the divine, how they approached moral decisions, and how they experienced the sacred directly. Unlike Western councils that filtered books for the sake of uniformity, Ethiopian Christianity judged texts by their ability to foster spiritual growth and direct encounter with God. That difference creates a perspective we rarely see outside Ethiopia. While the Western track emphasized doctrine and control, the Ethiopian track emphasized perception, transformation, and the practical application of faith in daily life. It's a reminder that Christianity wasn't monolithic, and that the canonical debates of Rome didn't erase entire alternative traditions. They just developed differently. And now, as modern seekers wrestle with questions that the old Western frameworks can't answer, the Ethiopian tradition suddenly feels immediate. It's not about exotic or forbidden knowledge. It's about ancient wisdom finally meeting a world ready to use it. What Ethiopia preserved isn't dusty history. It's a living map for encountering the sacred in ways that feel strikingly relevant today. So the real pivot becomes clear. These texts aren't just surviving relics. They are proof that two Christianities, asking different questions from the start, produce equally valid but radically different spiritual paths. And one of them has been quietly guiding seekers for nearly 2 millennia. So what's the takeaway from all of this? Christianity didn't unfold along a single straight line. From its earliest centuries, it branched into multiple streams, each asking different questions and pursuing different answers. Rome focused on unity, governance, and doctrinal clarity. Ethiopia focused on encounter, vision, and transformation. Both paths were intentional, both were coherent, and both produced rich traditions, but the story the world mostly learned only followed one of them. Today, that parallel path is no longer hidden. The Ethiopian manuscripts, the Mashafa Kidan, and other preserved texts offer a spiritual perspective that was quietly alive for over a millennium. They challenge assumptions about what Christianity should be and remind us that faith is not just rules and hierarchy. It can be lived, experiential, and visionary. And here's the profound question for every modern seeker. What happens if we stop assuming there's only one correct path to the divine? What happens if we start paying attention to the traditions that Western history overlooked? For some, it's an invitation to explore a Christianity that values direct experience, mystical insight, and inner transformation, just as Ethiopian monks have for centuries. History may have overlooked it, scholarship may have ignored it, but the spiritual insights preserved in Ethiopia have been quietly waiting. And now, for the first time in the wider world, they're ready to reshape how we understand faith, scripture, and the ways humanity has always sought the divine. The surprising part isn't just that these texts exist, it's what they mean for anyone looking for spirituality in the modern world. Millions of people today feel disconnected from rigid structures and repetitive rituals. They're searching for something alive, immediate, and personal. And in a way that feels almost uncanny, Ethiopian Christianity anticipated this need centuries ago. The preserved manuscripts, mystical instructions, and visionary texts weren't written to impress outsiders. They were written to guide communities in direct experience with the sacred. Prayer, perception, meditation, and transformation were central. The texts teach that salvation isn't just obedience to rules, but a reshaping of how one sees the world, interacts with kind, and engages with the divine presence. It's a radical shift from the way Western Christianity often frames faith, where one path emphasized codified law and hierarchical authority. The Ethiopian path prioritized insight, experience, and inner growth. For modern seekers, encountering these texts can feel like discovering a long-lost toolkit for living faith in a way that resonates deeply with contemporary spiritual curiosity. And the timing couldn't be more perfect. After centuries of neglect or misunderstanding, the wider world is finally ready to recognize what Ethiopian monks have known for generations, that the spiritual journey can be lived, seen, and felt in ways that go far beyond what history textbooks have taught. Looking back across centuries, one lesson becomes impossible to ignore. History is rarely as linear as we're taught. Christianity didn't simply emerge from Rome, spread outward, and solidify into one uniform faith. From the beginning, it branched, diverged, and adapted to local cultures, languages, and questions. Ethiopia offers a vivid example of what happens when a community asks a different question entirely. Not how do we enforce belief, but how do we experience the divine? That choice shaped everything. It preserved books that vanished elsewhere. It cultivated practices that Western councils often dismiss. And it created a spiritual imagination that remains alive and accessible even today. For modern seekers, there's a profound insight here. The spiritual world is broader than any single tradition or institution. There are paths that history forgot to highlight, yet they have always been waiting, quietly preserved by those who valued encounter over authority. And it's not just theory. The Ethiopian manuscripts, the mystical practices, the visionary texts, they show that spirituality can be rich, layered, and alive without relying on hierarchical control. They demonstrate that faith can adapt, evolve, and answer the deepest human questions across millennia. Ultimately, Ethiopia's parallel Christianity doesn't just rewrite the past. It offers a map for today, a way to engage with the sacred directly, to explore mystery without fear, and to rediscover wisdom that Western history left on the sidelines. So why is Ethiopia's tradition suddenly capturing global attention? The answer isn't that the texts are new, they've been there for centuries, but that the world is finally ready for them. Modern seekers are questioning rigid structures, rote rituals, and top-down authority in ways earlier generations didn't. People want direct experience, insight, and connection. And for over a millennium, Ethiopian Christianity has been quietly offering precisely that. The timing is uncanny. Centuries of preserved wisdom meet a generation hungry for depth, vision, and spiritual resonance. Ancient manuscripts written in Ge'ez carry layers of meaning that translation can only hint at, yet their core teachings remain clear. Encounter, transformation, and mystical insight are central to faith. The Church of Rome built unity and authority. Ethiopia built experience and perception. Both are valid, but the Ethiopian path feels startlingly modern modern because it addresses questions the West only recently began to ask. And here's the kicker. This isn't about secrets or conspiracies. The monks preserved these texts openly, integrating them into daily life, liturgy, and monastic teaching. The knowledge was never lost, just largely unrecognized. Today, that perspective offers an invitation to explore a Christianity that prioritizes personal encounter with the sacred, to see spirituality as living and experiential rather than static, and to realize that the divine has always been accessible through multiple paths, not just the one history has emphasized.
At the end of the day, the story of Ethiopian Christianity isn't just about ancient manuscripts or isolated traditions. It's about perspective. Two parallel Christianities grew from the same roots, asking different questions and shaping faith in radically different ways. Rome asked how belief could be governed. Ethiopia asked how it could be experienced. Both paths are valid, but one has long dominated the historical narrative, while the other quietly preserved the vision of spirituality that remains alive today. For modern seekers, the lesson is clear. Faith doesn't have to fit into a single framework. Scripture doesn't have to be only what councils decided, and encountering the sacred doesn't have to wait for permission or approval. The Ethiopian manuscripts and monastic traditions offer a blueprint for a faith that is mystical, experiential, and deeply personal. So the real revolution isn't about secret texts or hidden knowledge. It's about recognizing that humanity has always had multiple ways to connect with the divine, paths that sometimes run parallel, sometimes intersect, and sometimes challenge the story we've been told. What we do with that knowledge is up to us. Will we explore these paths, or will we continue assuming there's only one? History preserved the possibilities. Ethiopia quietly kept the map. And now, for anyone willing to look, the journey toward a richer, more direct experience of faith is finally within reach.